I'll do a quick intro whilst people are still joining. As you'll know, the Construction Forum session today is all about green heat, and we are joined by Steve Gummer, a partner in our infrastructure team. He's also our head of net zero, and I'll embarrass him slightly by saying that he's also an award-winning environmental and sustainability champion, having won Champion of the Year at the National Legal 500 ESG Awards recently, and ranked first for his practice area in Chambers. And he's going to take you through everything that you need to know about the exciting updates in green heat. And once he's bamboozled you with all of that, I will then run through some of the updates in the building safety space. And there's quite a bit to talk about, not least the fact that the head of the BSR stepped down yesterday. So it is all happening, people. So on that note, I will hand over to Steve to talk to us about green heat.
Thanks, Rach. I can't offer anyone resignations, I'm afraid, so I'll have to settle for the Energy Act instead. So I'm going to talk. If you go to the next slide, please, Melissa. So I'm going to talk today about all of the new regimes related to district heat networks, and then I'm going to very quickly circle back to those of you that either run or have relations with existing heat networks that are probably CHP based and not renewable at the end. So all of these regs will apply to all heat networks, but there are some specific realities with CHP based heat networks that are worth addressing at the end. So what is a district heat network? So it's a centralized system that supplies heat and hot water to multiple buildings or units within a building. So it can look like district heating, i.e. one energy center, which supports multiple buildings, or it can look like communal heating, i.e. a boiler in the basement, which supplies multiple units within a building. DHNs historically have offered environmental benefits, but they are doing so much more so now because they tend to be sourced from greener heat than the gas network. So whether or not it's air source or ground source heat pumps, or whether or not it's kind of solar to source heat, there are a range of ways in which green heat is powering these heat networks. Often there is some sort of worst case gas backup. The networks, the way they work is they are a separate set of piping. They circulate hot water. Interestingly, so these things used to run as kind of a circuit of hot water around buildings, or interestingly now they tend to use lower temperatures for more efficient energy generation, and then individual HIUs compress the liquid within homes in order to create the heat. Moving on, so this area historically, people have said it's been unregulated. That's not entirely true, but I won't bore you with the bits of the consumer regs that applied to it previously. But by and large, given that these are largely monopolistic supplies, so you're generally locked in to a heat network contract, if you've got one, they're generally monopolies. And so in 2023, the government introduced the Energy Act, which was a major development because it made Ofgem the regulator for overseeing compliance, protecting consumers, and ensuring district heat networks contribute to net zero targets. Heat network zoning was also introduced. So heat network zoning is effectively a way of creating areas where certain people are mandated to sign up. They have to sign up. At the moment, this isn't likely to apply to residential users. It's much more likely to apply to certain business users where the environmental case stacks up. So there are two sides to heat regulation, and I'll deal with each in turn. So next slide, please, Melissa. So the first is about consumer protection standards, etc. So those people who run a heat network, and by the way, you might well be one of them, whether you realize it or not. So important thing to check if you're a local authority is that you might well be running a heat network. If you're running a building and you're providing heat to customers, good chance you are. So they will have to obtain an authorization from Ofgem. At the moment, everyone automatically gets the authorization and will have to comply with the conditions. So that regime came into effect in April this year. However, the conditions haven't been passed yet. So at the moment, it's very easy to comply with. Ofgem published some draft conditions, and they're aiming to get the full conditions out by January 2026. Those conditions have a lot of kind of very, very high level standards, so fair pricing, reliable supply, transparent billing. What they do not have is something equivalent of sort of the energy price guarantee. So they don't have, for example, minimum prices and things like that, and they're not expected to yet. From a construction perspective, if you're building new heat networks, what is very important is that these things will be accompanied by technical standards. So that's the CIBSE Code of Practice, CP1. So those are technical standards for delivering your heat network. And they're really, really important. That's what good looks like. The other thing to mention in this regard, and what I've been telling clients who've been connecting to heat networks who've said, Steve, the regulations aren't in yet. How do I know what standards to conform to? What I've been telling them is look at the heat trust. So the heat trust was a voluntary regulatory regime, but had certain minimum outage standards and all of those things. So good to comply with that. Moving on, Melissa. Heat network zoning is the other side of the regulatory regime, which clearly identifies where district heat networks can most effectively which says that where heat networks can contribute effectively, there is a zone designated, and then effectively they become the monopoly provider within that zone. So it works like your water company. As yet, the regulations under which zoning will happen hasn't been implemented, nor have any zones been designated, but there is an advanced zoning program which is exploring zones, and that's being coordinated by DESNZ. Also, just briefly worth saying that the architecture for this regime requires one central government body, which is brilliantly called the Central Authority. I really, really enjoyed that. It can't sound more socialist than a central authority, though I'm reliably informed that government are changing the name. And then local zone coordinators. I expect that to be local authorities who will designate zones. What's interesting in that regard is that if local authorities also run heat networks and get powers as incumbents, there's a bit of a tension there. And then the thing to say is that there's a range of commercial models that might deliver heat networks. So whether it's kind of local authority led, or whether it's privately led, or whether it's a concession. And now there are these development agreements, and I'll circle back to those in a moment. Next slide, Melissa. So I'm not even going to bother boring you with the heat metering and billing regulations, only to note that just because there are some new regulations doesn't mean the old regulations have fallen away. In fact, they can't. I meet lots of people who are accidentally not complying with the heat metering and billing regulations, so I always refer to them. But they effectively determine the way that you meter, the accuracy of your metering, the billing information you have to provide to customers. Chances are if you bill for heat through a service charge, you might accidentally be breaching this if you haven't thought about it. Keep going, Melissa. So voluntary standards we've covered, so I will move on past that one. What I really want to get to is two things. So the first thing is government support for developing new heat networks. So that's this. So effectively, there are two schemes. There is the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which provides grants for existing CHNs, and the Green Heat Network Fund, which provides funding for the development of new heat networks. Also critical to this was the PSDS, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, which has been abolished, but that did some pretty important work on secondary networks, and so there's a bit of a gap there at the moment, because it's one thing building a heat network, but your homes need to be compatible with the heat network. Melissa, if you just move on quickly and move past conclusion and key takeaways to the next slide. So what I wanted to focus on for the last 10 minutes, given that this is a construction forum, are the specific construction issues that arise in this regulatory framework. So as part of developing any heat network, there are a whole range of construction contracts needed. And I just wanted to talk about some of the issues that I've come across when I've been negotiating these forms. So delay and just in no specific order, delay and liquidated damages, they are really, really important. So they are really important because heat networks will have deadlines by which they have to kind of have power on. But also grant funding is normally conditional upon things being delivered by a certain time. So obviously backing off your LDs and building in headroom in your LDs and your program is really, really important. Obviously all of your standard forms, your JCT, your NEC, they allow tailored LD clauses. And what you need to do is back those off against your concession model. I don't think you're ever going to get to a stage where you kind of back the entire loss of your grant funding off against LDs. I don't think that's the point. The point is to make sure that if you're in pain, your contractor's in pain too. Performance guarantees are really, really important. So this goes to three things to my mind. It goes to network output, network reliability, and network efficiency. So if you are the operator of a heat network or a customer of a heat network, you care that it's on, you care that it's providing heat at the temperature it said it was going to, but you also care about its efficiency from an environmental perspective. How efficient is the system at generating heat? Generally, we see kind of guarantees in certain construction contracts with financial penalties attached to underperformance against these standards. Normally, the way this works is we will keep our construction contractor on for the 2 years post completion, and they will do a degree of the O&M for those first 2 years before you appoint an O&M contractor. But in those years, you will also kind of measure performance. What we found hasn't worked quite so well, and that is sort of common in perhaps some other kind of ICHEME type factory facility type arrangements, is kind of spot tests at the completion date that measure efficiency. What you want to do is see it operating over a period of time. Right, construction costs and fixed price versus target cost, so generally there are kind of fixed price models for the initial works, and gigantic but on this. Heat networks often require incremental expansion. They often require incremental connection works. So when you are letting your construction contract, it's a good idea to make arrangements for all of those things. Those are plainly not going to be doable on just pure fixed price. They might be incremental. They might be kind of task order based, but it's important to think about that when you're setting out your construction contract. Design responsibility and completion definitions are things I spend far too much time talking about on heat networks. So due to the technical complexity when you're kind of letting a heat network, obviously the most common approach is a kind of output type spec, but with then design responsibility passed down to your D&B contractor. There are some challenges with that, because actually normally by the time you come to appoint the contractor, you've done some planning, you've got some of your grid connections, you've done some of those things, and so inherently some of that design risk, you've made some of those key design decisions perhaps before you've appointed your contractor. So ECI can be helpful in that regard, getting people on board early, because otherwise there becomes this real tension. The other thing is about completion, because obviously you can get heat on in a first tranche of premises. It tends to be that you don't connect every home in a heat network at the same time. You'll do tranche by tranche, and so there can be some issues there. But normally you kind of have milestones. You have incremental kind of payments, and it's important to think about the release of the final sum at the end. Asset ownership and risk transfer. It sounds like it should be quite straightforward, and shouldn't do anything too whizzy. The thing to say is that network assets are often quite dispersed in nature, specifically across kind of district heat, where things kind of flow across a village or a town. So you're traveling across multiple properties. You need clear legal structures, you need easements, you need leases, you need to make sure that all of those things transition into the property arrangements. And also, one of the things I spend loads and loads of time talking about is insurance. So say you've got a communal heat network in a building, you've got a kind of pure insurance challenge, which is you'll have contractors all risk for the actual building of the system, but then you might sometimes have a debate between whether or not, because some of it becomes a fixture in the building, do you want to put it on the landlord's insurance? Do you want to put it in the building insurance, or do you want to put it in the contractor's third-party liability insurance? I've done both. And the good thing is that both JCT and NEC have insurance options that kind of cater for both, but you do actively need to think about it. consents and permissions, it is so easy to write, and the contractor will get all consents. That is not always the best way to go on these NEC on these heat contracts, and you need to think very, very specifically about what consents sit where. So you've got your planning consent. Obviously, you've got your regulatory consents I spoke about before, the authorizations, and those need to sit with the owner. But then you've got things like highways, you've got things like land rights, and you've got things like environmental permits. Now, some of those things lend themselves to being managed by the operator, and some of those things lend themselves to kind of being dealt with by the kind of managing authority. Sorry, I saw a question about should we be on the next slide. We probably should be, but I've got 3 slides with these issues, but all they do is summarize them. So I think Melissa, if you jump to the next slide down, and then the last thing is sort of contract forms. What contract form should I be using? Candidly, the standard forms work fine. JCT, NEC work fine. They do all require adjustment for district heating. They do all require real thinking about in some of those areas I've spoken about, but they've got the mechanics to do all of that. What have I used? I've used JCT D&B. I've used NEC option A. Somebody made me use JCT option C, but I think A probably works better. I've used iChemie Redbook for the plant, for the energy centre. If I am totally honest, we Sharp Pritchard have our own bespoke version of a construction contract, which we developed. The reason why is the tail where D&B turns into O&M. So some of the panels did this initially. I think the refit panel led by local partnerships did this, where they tried to merge the two. They did that via a framework, so it wasn't quite perfectly. To my mind, it didn't quite perfectly join up, but it was the right idea. But we SP have got a kind of standard bespoke contract on. We're always happy to kind of share that and discuss that with people. So we'll do that. Melissa, I think there's one more slide which I think just covers things that I've already spoken about. Just very quickly, obviously, there are some other things that just always come up on these contracts, and one of them is performance bonding and parent company guarantees. Lots of the players, particularly the tier 1 players in this space, they're very big players. They've been doing it for a very long time. And so it's not always so easy to get guarantees in the way that you might normally do. There's quite a lot. I find that your Rambolls, your Arups, your kind of core contractors have quite a lot of power in this market, and so some of the things that you might normally sort of ask for in a sort of more where the market's more competitive are harder to obtain, but you can normally get performance guarantees, parent guarantees to a degree. The other thing to say is just skills shortage. Final point, because obviously the government did its industrial strategy yesterday. Really, really important to ask about subcontracting, because whilst you've got your tier 1 and they're all excellent, and I've spoken about lots of them, actually lots of the installing, lots of the doing will be done by your tier 2s. And there is a real shortage of people who are really good at this. And there's a lot of this going on. So really important to get into the subcontracting in the procurement phase and understand it. I will stop there.